Hello, I'm Simon, and this video is based on a talk I gave at IATEFL in May 2022. So, by way of a brief introduction, I'm a teacher and a teacher educator and a manager, and I have been for the last 30 years. And for some of that time, it's been great, and for some of that time, it's been pretty terrible. And the last 10 years or so, I was in Shanghai, working in a centre there as an academic director. But then, like for all of us, COVID came along and things changed very quickly. And so for the last couple of years, I've had a lot more time on my hands. So I thought I'd use this newly discovered free time to try and make some sense of some of the things that I've been involved in. Overall, that's what this is all about, making sense of things. And so I'm not going to try to introduce you to some kind of radical new method. I'm not going to try and solve all of your many problems. I'm sure you have a lot. If anything, the chances are that after this video, which probably will be about 20 minutes or so, you may leave with more questions than actually when you started watching. Actually, if you finish with more questions than when you started, that would be a good result for me. Also, as you'll see when we go through, there's quite a lot of different books and ideas and people mentioned in this. They're going to come at you fairly quickly, but this is on video now. So if you want to, you'll be able to find out for yourself what I'm talking about, because I'll give you a reference and you could go away and read whatever you like. Another issue that's kind of important for this is the idea that I'm not really looking for kind of either or kind of. I'm not going to compare things and say this is the right one and this is the wrong one. Generally, what I'm looking for is situations where we've got both, and then also looking for something more. So both and is probably more important than either or. Also, I'm going to mention the word complexity. We'll get to complexity maybe in a few minutes, but suffice to say that complexity, as I'm talking about it here, is not the same as complicated. And finally, anybody who saw my talk last year at IATEFL on functional stupidity probably already knows a little bit about where I'm coming from. Also, earlier this year, I did a presentation about why things go wrong in organizations. And after that was something that made me think, well, along the same lines, but instead of thinking about what goes wrong, I wanted to think more about what's the right and the wrong, what's the good and the bad, or, as is the title of this talk, what are the virtues and vices of what I do as an ELT leader or manager. So as a really quick starting point, you can stop the video and have a longer think about it if you want, but on the screen now you're going to see some ideas. Ooh, do these seem like virtues or vices to you? Now, unfortunately, because the time's relatively short, I can't work through all of these examples today, but I'm going to look at a couple. Also, as I mentioned at IATEFL last year, I talked about something called functional stupidity. So stupidity is one of those things that probably seems like a bad thing, right? But actually, we can see that within the way that organizations work, the right kind of stupidity can actually be really, really useful for both the individuals and the organization. Depends how you look at it. So today, I'm going to look at, first of all, creativity, and then I'm going to move on to hypocrisy. So I think all of us have probably seen a scene like this in a coffee shop that we've been to. Could be anywhere in the world. What do you think when you see this? So for me, aside from thinking, am I going to be able to find anywhere to sit, and is there somewhere for me to charge my computer? I'm also thinking, what are these people doing? Now, maybe for me at least, I don't usually assume that they're doing some kind of, well, to me, boring job like data processing or something like that. Now, to me, it looks as if they're doing something exciting, something creative. Maybe they're writing a script for Netflix. Maybe they're doing some kind of vlogging for something, and they're editing some exciting TikTok video. I don't know, whatever it is, right? Of course, if it's near a school, there's every possibility they may be planning a lesson. But at least, maybe to me, this picture kind of looks like a picture of creativity. Is that how it looks to you? So, we know what creativity looks like, but how do we define it? Well, on the screen now, you should be able to see a couple of quotes. And both of these quotes come from the same book called Against Creativity by Ollie Mould. Good book. And the key idea, if I can do justice in just a minute or two, is that our idea of creativity has changed over the years, over the span of human societies. So that maybe in ancient Greece, creativity was a gift from the gods. At other times, it's been maybe more of a collective tool, something where the creative is a kind of artisan who creates things that are useful for society as a whole. But in the modern world, I think creativity has come to have monetary value. And so basically, creativity is value. And the power of creativity has been exploited to some extent by capitalist societies, which is something that Ollie Mould spends a lot of time talking about. So to use an example, we've all known about the idea of creative industries for a long time. It's been around since the 90s, at least in the UK. So the idea of creative industry is the idea that maybe you could work in a TV and film or theatre, or maybe even publishing or something like that. But if you ever follow what's happened with these things in the newspapers or on the TV, you find that actually in the past, these things have been open to exploitation. Me Too, for example, is just a quick one. But Ollie Mould also goes on to talk about the way that the idea of creativity has become more and more important in the work of people who traditionally maybe wouldn't have been considered as creative. So, for example, healthcare or technology or even education. So, of course, creativity is a good thing, right? Well, no, maybe not. Depends on the situation. And I'm going to start by talking about the idea of precarity, which is, you can find useful discussions about this in articles by Keith Copley and Paul Walsh in ELT Journal, and also English Teaching Professional. They're quite recent ones, where they're talking about that teachers have often come under different new kinds of pressures in recent times. So, for example, maybe in the past, the jobs were more secure, but nowadays they become less secure. So very often in some modern schools, we have less access to good working conditions, maybe fewer good developmental opportunities, maybe less decent pay than they used to be. And so this, the life of a teacher can be more precarious than it once was, we could say. And one of the ways that the employer gets to excuse this or maybe hide this is by presenting these changes as an opportunity for greater professional freedom and creativity. So, for example, creativity could be a cost-cutting exercise. So maybe the organisation refuses to provide appropriate teaching materials which the teacher may need in the classroom, but maybe it's presented to the teacher as a creative opportunity so that they can make use of their time to do something and to show how creative they are as an individual, for example. Or perhaps maybe there's a difficult working condition where, I don't know, there's a lack of access to suitable technology, or maybe the organisation of the groupings of students, for example, isn't very good. They're not graded well or they're not very well selected. But rather than the teacher being able to complain about this, they may be told that this is an opportunity for them to show their creativity in problem solving and that it's actually a valuable professional developmental experience. So of course, I'm not saying that there is no such thing as creativity or that teachers can't be creative in terms of maybe a more traditional view of how we create. But it does also seem possible that creativity can be used in a fairly negative way. So, I really like Ollie Mold's book. I think it's really interesting. It's very kind of thought-provoking, I think, in many ways. But as you can probably already guess, it's also quite critical. And it comes from a kind of, say, Marxist critical position on capitalism, which I'm not criticising, many people are into. But there is something for me to think about here, which is about my own experience as a manager. So how do I feel about the notion that as the manager and working maybe in something like this, that I'm the exploiter? Am I deliberately twisting the notion of what teacher as a creative means? Am I trying to manipulate them for my own personal advantage? I don't think so. I certainly hope not. I mean, that's not what I got into management for. But I have to concede that maybe the organisation that I work for may be doing this, maybe even if it's doing it unwittingly. So the idea that I may be doing bad things as a manager, even though I may not be really aware of it, is linked to an idea of complexity, I would say. And I hope that the next example also comes back to the idea of complexity. So as I said, I've been in management for quite a long time now, but like almost all other managers in ELT, I had to learn a lot when I started because I didn't have that much experience and I had to read something about it, right? So most managers, when they begin, they get something like this, which is a really, really good way to start. And one of the big ideas that I really appreciated when I first started was the idea of Peter Senge's learning organisation. So this was a very attractive idea, probably still is for most people, because there's a kind of very pleasing loop to the idea. So we kind of suggest that in the same way that all of the people who come along to our organisation are learning for their whatever needs, the organisation itself is learning. All of the people in it are learning, and the organisation itself learns and develops as part of this, right? Something along those lines. And you can see the quote on the screen right here. So you can see, sounds like a great idea, very compelling. The problem has been that in real life, it hasn't really turned out like this most of the time. Why not? Well, actually, at least partly for reasons that Senge himself already spotted right from the beginning. He knew about the complexity of organisations and that needed to be taken into account. Unfortunately, most of the time, most organisations haven't taken complexity into account. And one reason for that is, as you can see, this book was originally written quite a long time ago, 1990. And ideas about complexity theory have really changed and developed and come on a lot since then, in the last 30 years or so. So this is probably a good time to mention complexity theory again. And as I said at the beginning, complexity isn't the same as complicated. Now, if you want to know what it is, well, something like this by Diane Larson Freeman is a pretty good place to start, especially because she's talking about the applied linguistics context. But as you can see on the screen, just a very simple slide talking about what some of the elements of what makes complexity complex. These are ideas that create a very specific way of looking at a system. For Diane Larson Freeman in this book, most of the time she's looking at language. But for others, for me today, I'm thinking about an organisation as a complex adaptive system that's full of people. And that can be a problem. So, like I said, why is it that all of our schools don't end up being these perfect kind of learning organization where everything works the way that we want it to? Well, actually, another useful book for us to think about here is this one by Niels Brunson. And he thinks about the concept of hypocrisy. One of the interesting ways that he kind of comes into this is to think that there was a time when, maybe in the past, where the major focus of organization studies was what does the organization produce? But as I mentioned, in recent times, we've changed and a lot more focus now goes into how does the organization actually work? The problem is that we kind of imagine organizations to be these kind of rational places that are focused and consistent and coordinated to achieving whatever it is that they are set out to achieve, like teaching people English, for example. But that's not what they're like. I'm sure, just like me, you see that isn't what happens in an organization, even when it's working well. They're full of conflict, they're full of inconsistency, they're full of contradictions, even though they still somehow manage to achieve what it is that they are designed to achieve. So doing what they're supposed to do is only part of the story. So take language schools, for example, right? They offer all kinds of services to help people achieve certain educational goals. And they do it in lots of different ways. And they do it kind of like some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are expensive, some of them are cheap. Some of them have very big classes of people and do it in a certain way. And some people like to do it in very small classes and do it in another way. But it doesn't matter in some ways how they're doing it. Always there's something bubbling away under the surface. There are battles for resources. There are power struggles for position. There's a struggle over the control of the direction of the organization as well. Most of the time, the leader and the manager, part of it is just trying to keep some kind of equilibrium, just trying to keep the thing going. And you keep a balance for a while, but very often some organizations just lose their balance and they tip over and disappear. So that's part of the way that complexity works in an organization. And in some ways, it's kind of part of the job to, like I say, just kind of keep things stable. So I'd suggest that for a manager like me, we need to be aware of some ideas about how this complexity works. And as organizations are political places, one of the areas to focus on is the idea of hypocrisy. So as you may remember from that slide I gave you about complexity a couple of minutes ago, complex organizations are non-linear. But the traditional view, the kind of a traditional administrative view of management, is that there is a clear one-way direction between, say, people, managers and leaders talking, maybe leaders making decisions, and then actions happening as a result of those decisions. Basically, the boss tells us what to do and we do it. But the idea of organization of hypocrisy is that the relationship between talk, decisions, and actions isn't necessarily causal or one way. The job of the manager is often to make it appear that there's a clear and consistent causal link between decisions and actions, even when there isn't. Often, the main job of the manager is a kind of political role of making things appear to be more organized than they are. Let's take a different example, okay? And this one kind of, originally comes from David Hume. So let's look at this picture, right? So take this example of a man riding an elephant. Now, in general, we assume, well, I do at least, that the man is making these decisions about where to go. So he uses his human reason to direct the elephant. And the elephant is doing what it's told. But do we have to see it that way? Actually, there's also a perfectly good possibility that the elephant is going wherever it wants to go. The man's job is to justify the decisions that the elephant is making. So, for example, the elephant turns left, and then the man says loudly so that everybody can hear, "I'm turning left because I wanted to turn left all along," even though actually he didn't have any part in it. So very often our reason, our rationality is often used to justify things after they've happened rather than planning the decision in the first place. So interestingly, as you may have guessed already, the idea of organisation of hypocrisy is an essential management tool in a complex organisation. In fact, if you didn't do this, it probably wouldn't work. However, paradoxically, if this tool of hypocrisy that the manager is using has to remain a secret. We can't tell people that we are being hypocritical. We can't say, today I'm using the hypocrite approach to management, because as soon as we let people know that's what we're doing, it doesn't work anymore. So, I don't know about you, but speaking from personal experience, the idea that I have to be knowingly hypocritical to do my job, but I'm not really allowed to let anybody know that that's what I'm doing, feels pretty stressful. Okay, so maybe this is one of the things that leads to managerial burnout. I wouldn't be surprised. And this seems to be a question that I'm still puzzling over with complexity theory in general. In that complexity seems like a really good description of what actually is happening all around me in my organization. But I'm not really sure it's helping me very much to decide on what's right or what's wrong. As Niels Brunson says in his book, the morality of the organisation of hypocrisy is kind of vague. Management hypocrisy can be a tool to use. We can use it to achieve organisational goals. So basically, it can be an efficient way to get to do whatever it is the organisation wants to do. But organisational goals could be either good or bad. So this leads me to a kind of, let's say, a summary of where we've got a bit of a problem about the rights and the wrongs of complex organisations. So the first one is, again, casting your mind back to the idea of complexity, about agency, about the idea that the role of the individual, as in terms of being able to take control, can be diminished in a complex organisation. The role of one person is always kind of de-centred. I'm never doing it all. So it can seem really difficult to know, how can I actually influence things? And this is connected to that idea I mentioned with creativity. Remember about, I don't want to exploit people's creativity, even though maybe sometimes I have. Because the values of an organisation can be quickly twisted or abandoned in the need to engage with just the political necessity of getting the organisation to produce what it needs to produce, or to actually act. Another thing that's kind of important, which in some ways is maybe a combination of one and two here, which is that members of organisations, complex organisations, can become jaded, burnt out, stressed, cynical. I know I've been there. It can be difficult to remain positive and hopeful. So complexity can often seem as if it's at least amoral, even if it's not actually immoral. So we're getting towards the end now. But as I hope you can see, I'm still trying to make sense of these difficult questions with examples like creativity and hypocrisy that we see. Are they good or bad? Well, they're both. It depends what's happening in the complex organizations that we work for. But I'm still searching for something. I want to know, how do we produce hope? How do we do things differently? Now, as I said at the beginning, I can't offer you an immediate or easy answer or a worksheet or anything else that you're going to be able to work through. But when it comes to making sense of things, my first go-to point is maybe a philosophical one. because I think it's very, very important to try to have a big picture understanding of what's going on, or we could say an ontological framework. But that can be a very, very difficult thing to do because, well, this quote that I've got on the screen now is a great one in a book that I've been reading recently. It's hard to get back to find out what we actually really believe in and where we need to start. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not going to offer you any easy answers. But there are a couple of things that I could suggest. So the first one is Judith Shklar, and her most famous philosophical book is actually about hypocrisy, among many other things that she calls ordinary vices. It's written quite a long time ago now, 70 years ago? But she talks about the idea that actually in everyday life, hypocrisy is kind of acceptable and useful. Why? Because hypocrisy allows us to avoid the much, much worse vices or vice of cruelty, or avoids the fear of cruelty that shapes so many people's lives. So cruelty is the worst thing that we can suffer, and all that a society can inflict on us. So other issues that are relatively bad, like hypocrisy, don't seem so bad in a perspective where we are preventing the cruelty that is the worst of all possible evils. It's an interesting idea, worth exploring. Another one, I suppose, is Aristotle. So Aristotle's ideas are really, really famous, right? If you've never read Aristotle, well, obviously go and read Aristotle himself. But if you want a background, Alistair MacIntyre's work on ethics is really good when he's discussing Aristotle. I'd recommend it if you want an interesting background. But, I mean, to summarise Aristotle is difficult. But at least in theory, the idea is that Aristotle is interesting in what is the good. And the good is what leads to the flourishing of society as a whole. And a good person is the person who trains themselves in virtue. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about Aristotle is that he talks about wisdom. But he doesn't just have kind of one idea of wisdom, he has two. One of them, he calls Sophia, is kind of the wisdom that comes from learning, from reading, from contemplation, a kind of theoretical wisdom, I suppose. But there is a second kind of wisdom, which he calls phronesis. That's phronesis with a PH because it's Greek, right? But this phronesis is practical. We see it in action by people who act carefully, prudently, that kind of wisdom. And maybe I would suggest we don't talk enough about phronesis. Perhaps we should talk about it more. But the final thing that I wanted to talk about is another philosopher. But this is interesting because in a way this guy isn't interested in the right and wrong of things. That's not really what his philosophy is about. But he does discuss this. And you can see a link to the article, a very clear, I think, easy to read article about this, where Gilles Deleuze is talking about the difference between ethics and morality. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this right now because I'm not going to be able to do it justice. When I tried this in the session at IATEFL, I realised there was just no time to be able to do this justice. So if you want to know about what Gilles Deleuze thinks about ethics or morality or anything else, well, you could do worse than to get hold of a copy of this book by Todd May about Gilles Deleuze. As you can see, my version is very dog-eared because I use it a lot. And one of the things is that I think there's an awful lot that is useful in the ideas of Gilles Deleuze when it comes to educational leadership and management. But as I say, there's not enough time for me to talk about it right now. So I'm thinking that this would be a good topic to talk about for next year's IATEFL. So I'm going to start planning that right now. But like I said at the beginning, I hope I've given you some ideas. I hope I've given you some questions to think about, even though I haven't given you very many answers. And I hope that you can join me in my next session, I hope, at IATEFL in Harrogate in 2023. So thanks for watching, and see you then.